Hello, welcome to This Side of the Ceiling. I'm Kelsey.
And I'm Jill, and we're two good friends trying to live this life on this side of the ceiling as abundantly as Christ has called us to.
We are by no means experts, but we love to study His Word and share everything that He has revealed and taught us.
So come along with us as we open up the scriptures and dive into His wonderful Word.
Hello, welcome back to This Side of the Ceiling, and we are in a study of David.
That's right, man after God's own heart.
And last week we wrapped up a hard teaching about David and his sin with Bathsheba and his confrontation with Nathan. And then last week we talked about his journal, which we know was written at least a year after it happened. And so some of the lessons I think I took away from that, David said in that psalm, "You do not delight in sacrifice, or I would bring it. You do not delight in burnt offerings. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart."
Mm-hmm.
And so it made me think about, am I letting the Spirit convict me
Right.
with sin?
Yeah, and I do think the way you said that is so true. The Spirit convicts us. I think Satan accuses us.
Yeah.
I was reading that in one of my readings this morning that Satan accuses us of our sin and says, "You're awful and you'll never be any better."
Right.
But the Holy Spirit convicts us of
Yeah.
sin, and we saw that in David. He humbled himself and God restored him. And
Yeah.
if we let Satan just accuse us, we just feel worse.
Right.
For no
yeah,
avail.
And he wanted a new heart. He didn't want just a clean heart. He wanted a pure heart, a new heart, and he asked for that. And I think God honored that in David. So it was a great lesson, but we're going to move on in 2 Samuel.
Yeah, and today we want to look not so much at David, but David was a shepherd, and David was a musician, and David was a warrior, and David was a king, and David has been a sinner. And for the next couple of weeks, we're going to look at David as a father. David had several wives, and we've talked about Abigail and Michael and Bathsheba now, but he also had other wives that he married for political reasons, and so he has children, and his firstborn son, who would be the normal one to take the throne, is Amnon.
Right.
And then he also has a son that we're going to read about today named Absalom. And from what I can tell, Absalom would be, Amnon has a sister named Tamar. And then there's another son, Jonadab. There's another son, not Jonadab. Jonadab's going to be in our story today. But Absalom is the third born son. So let's just start by reading about Amnon. And we're going to see a little peek into some family dynamics. Now, the one other thing to remember is that one of the consequences of David's sin with Bathsheba is that the Lord tells him, you're going to have strife in your own family.
Right.
And it's not going to go away. And so we're going to see some of that in the next few chapters. And so let's start by, if you want to, let's just read the first 22 verses of 2 Samuel 13, and we will get a little insight into some of the family dynamics.
Okay, I'm going to read chapter 13. In the course of time, Amnon, son of David, fell in love with Tamar, the beautiful sister of Absalom, son of David.
Oh, let me stop you. I think I just said earlier that was Amnon's sister, but it's Absalom's sister, of course.
Same father.
The same
David.
father. Yes.
Amnon became frustrated to the point of illness on account of his sister Tamar, for she was a virgin, and it seemed impossible for him to do anything to her. Now Amnon had a friend named Jonadab, son of Shimea, David's brother. Jonadab was a very shrewd man. He asked Amnon, "Why do you, the king's son, look so haggard morning after morning? Won't you tell me?" Amnon said to him, "I'm in love with Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister." "Go to bed and pretend to be ill," Jonadab said. "When your father comes to see you, say to him, 'I would like my sister Tamar to come and give me something to eat.' Let her prepare the food in my sight so I may watch her and then eat it from her hand." So Amnon lay down and pretended to be ill. When the king came to see him, Amnon said to him, "I would like my sister Tamar to come and make some special bread in my sight so I might eat from her hand." David sent word to Tamar at the palace, "Go to the house of your brother Amnon and prepare some food for him." So Tamar went to the house of her brother Amnon, who was lying down. She took some dough, kneaded it, made the bread in his sight, and baked it. Then she took the pan and served him the bread, but he refused to eat. "Send everyone out of here," Amnon said. So everyone left him. Then Amnon said to Tamar, "Bring the food here into my bedroom so I may eat from your hand." And Tamar took the bread she had prepared and brought it to her brother Amnon in his bedroom. But when she took it to him to eat, he grabbed her and said, "Come to bed with me, my sister." "Don't, my brother," she said to him. "Don't force me. Such a thing should not be done in Israel. Don't do this wicked thing. What about me? Where could I get rid of my disgrace? And what about you? You would be like one of the wicked fools in Israel. Please speak to the king. He will not keep me from being married to you." But he refused to listen to her, and since he was stronger than she, he raped her. Then Amnon hated her with intense hatred. In fact, he hated her more than he had loved her. Amnon said to her, "Get up and get out." "No," she said to him, "sending me away would be a greater wrong than what you have already done to me." But he refused to listen to her. He called his personal servant and said, "Get this woman out of here and bolt the door after her." So his servant put her out and bolted the door after her. She was wearing a richly ornamented robe, for this was the kind of garment the virgin daughters of the king wore. Tamar put ashes on her head and tore the ornamented robe that she was wearing. She put her hand on her head and went away, weeping loudly as she went. Her brother Absalom said to her, "Has that Amnon your brother been with you? Be quiet now, my sister. He is your brother. Don't take this thing to heart." And Tamar lived in her brother Absalom's house, a desolate woman. When King David heard about all this, he was furious. Absalom never said a word to Amnon, either good or bad. He hated Amnon because he had disgraced his sister Tamar.
Okay, this is an ugly story.
Yes.
And we see the sin of Amnon raping his sister.
Yes.
But I want us to look at if we can trace the sin a little bit, because we know that we're all sinful. And the idea would be to try to stop sin before it has its way.
Right.
And so I think if you look back, I just think it's helpful to kind of trace some things that are going on here. And you'll notice that it says in verse 1 that Amnon notices his beautiful sister and that he loves her. But then you see that, and that's not wrong.
Right.
He just notices her and he loves her. But then he feeds it. He feeds that, and that pure love turns into a lust. And, lust is selfish and, not open to reason. And that, as he feeds that, it begins to torment him. And that's all he can think about. And it makes him physically sick. And so then he tells this, quote, friend of his, Jonadab, about, he notices, "You're sick. What's going on? You're not yourself." And he says, "I want my sister." And this friend, Jonadab, gives him bad advice.
Yeah, he affirms.
Yeah, he does. He affirms. He tells him what he wants to hear. You're a king's son. You can have what you want. Here's how to get it.
Right.
And so, another failure, he's getting along the way. He hasn't sinned yet, other than lusting. But he listens to bad advice. He listens to what he wants to hear. And so then he goes into, he was ill enough that his friend notices. But now he pretends to be really sick, like he's not getting out of bed, because he knows that eventually his dad will come check on him.
Right.
So his dad does come to check on him, and he tells him, "All I want is for my sister to bake her bread." and feed it to me. And here again, we see that David tends to give his children what they want.
Right.
And so he does. And then when he does ask Tamar to lie with him. And she says, oh no, let's get married. Now, at first we would think that that is like incest. But, they did have different mothers. Mm-hmm. And I think it could have been done back in those days. We worry about there being effects for the children now. And, back then there might not have hadn't been as many generations. So I don't know, but apparently that was an option.
Right.
Sounds like that was an option that would have been okay, and she's okay with it. Let's just get married. But no, he has her in his sights. He has her in his bedroom. And so after he asks, she says no, he takes.
Right.
And notice how quickly after he takes, the very next verse, he hates her. He hates her.
Even more than he loved her.
Yes, so quickly everything turns. And that's one of the lies of Satan, is that if we give into this sin, it's going to help us. Mm-hmm. And no,
satisfy us.
Yeah, or satisfy us or whatever. Mm-hmm. But sin lies to us and always requires more than we're willing, takes us farther. You've heard all that than we thought it would. And
right.
So then he hates her and throws her out. I just think we see a progression of sin. Mm-hmm. And it reminds me of in the New Testament in James, there's a verse in James chapter 1 that talks about when you're being tempted, and also talks a little bit about the progression of sin. In verse 13 through 14, it says, let no one say when he's tempted, I'm being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil. He himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he's lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death.
Yeah, which isn't instant. It's a process.
Yeah, and hopefully along the way, when God talks about giving us out, that God doesn't give you a sin where there aren't ways to get away from it. And Amnon had choices along the way, we can see, but he didn't.
Mm-hmm. He listened to Jonadab and he gave in.
Yeah, and let's talk about that little friend there for a minute. Let's just talk about that friend of Jonadab, because we've already talked about friends. Mm-hmm. David had a friend, Jonathan, that is the example of what a friendship should be. Mm-hmm. Jonathan could have told David what he wanted to hear. Come back to the palace. Everything's going to be great.
Right.
That would have what Jonathan wanted too. But Jonathan had David's best interest at heart. And he said, you've got to run. You've got to leave. Get away while you can. And it caused them both to be at tears. And
hard decisions.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so, but in this case, we have this friend who's telling him what he wants to hear. And so I think we all need to have friends that we, first of all, give permission to say what we need to hear, that we will listen to.
Right.
Because sometimes if
Even
a friend...
when it's hard.
Yeah, because sometimes if a friend says something that you don't want to hear, then you just think they're not a friend. And so we need to have relationships in our life where people can say... I think we both share a friend, and he tells a story all the time of someone coming up to him and saying, like if it was me, Jill, I love you. Yes. That I would never say something to intentionally hurt you. Yes. You're being selfish. That right. Kind of a friend that says, hey, I would never intentionally hurt you. That I love you. You're wrong.
Right.
You're being prideful. You're being selfish. This is a sin.
Right.
So I think that is one of the things that we learn here. And I want us to keep reading here because Jonadab is going to come back up. Mm-hmm. Not only was he not a true friend to Amnon, but now I want us to look and see what David does. We've seen David has come, he's being a doting father to come check on his son when he's sick. He does give him the first thing he asked for. Mm-hmm. But now we're going to see what happens because Absalom he takes his sister in, and the first thing he says is, "Oh, it's your brother. Just come live with me."
Right.
But sin is going to be building up in Absalom as well. And he is not saying anything, but he has bitterness in his heart against his brother. And in this family, they're not talking about it. They're just letting it build.
And it's somewhat justified.
Yes.
The anger that he has.
Yeah. And let's just talk about Tamar here. She seems to be doing everything right. She wants to go bake bread for her brother. She comes into his room and feeds it to her. Some sisters would go, "I'm not feeding that to you," And she comes in and does that. Even when he wants to take her, she gives him a way to legally do this.
Right.
And then when he rapes her, she immediately tears her princess clothing. And she has to live
desolate.
Yeah, so you feel for her. The women in our story so far, you wouldn't want to be any of them.
No.
So you do feel for her. We can't understand exactly the way the times were back then, but yes, you definitely feel for Tamar, and we don't hear anything from her other than that little tagline that she lived a desolate life. But let's look at David's response and what happens. Starting in verse 23, if you want to read 23 through 39, this is going to get us through the whole chapter, mostly here. Well, let me kind of give you a little, we won't read the whole chapter. Let me tell you a little bit what happens. In verse 23, it says 2 years pass.
Right.
So you've got Absalom, nothing's
Stewing.
happened. Yeah, he's stewing. 2 years pass. And then Absalom is a shepherd, and it's time for the shearers to come and shear the sheep, and that's a big festival time. And so Absalom goes to David, and he says, "Please let the king and his servants go with me to this."
Right.
So he's asking his dad to come celebrate this time. But the king says to Absalom, "No, my son, let us not all go, lest we be a burden to you." And Absalom pressed him, but David would not go, but he gave him his blessing. Then Absalom said, "If not, then let my brother Amnon go with us." And the king said to him, "Why should he go with you?" But Absalom pressed him until he let Amnon and all the king's sons go with him. So you could have to wonder if it feels like that was Absalom's plan all along. Because what happens is they all get up there, and Absalom has this clever plan to have his servants kill Amnon. And that's what happens, and all the king's sons flee.
Right.
So this was his plan all along. So you think, did he know that
David would say no.
Yeah. David kind of takes the right answer of, "Oh, I don't want to be a burden to you," but then he doesn't follow it up.
Yeah.
You kind of think that
Absalom knew his father, sounded like. So, because when David said no, he said, "Okay, well then let Amnon come with us."
Yeah, and sometimes I think, okay, what's the lesson here? Like, sometimes we know the right thing to do, like, we should go. But instead of just saying, "I don't want to go," we make up this reason that sounds good, like, "Oh, I don't want to be a burden to you."
Right.
And so it makes us sound good for not doing what we don't want to do anyway.
Right.
And I don't know David's heart, but I think sometimes we don't do the right thing and we make this excuse that sounds good. Mm-hmm. If David would have gone, I don't think he would have killed Amnon.
Probably not.
So anyway, what happens though is David is sitting at home because he did not go, and it says that news gets to him. And this is the news that David hears. It's not the correct news at first. It says Absalom has struck down all the king's sons, and not one of them is left. Then the king arose and tore his garments and lay on the earth, and all of his servants who were standing by tore their garments. But Jonadab, here's Jonadab again, who is the son of David's brother. So Jonadab is a cousin here. Mm-hmm. He says, "Let not my lord suppose that they have killed all the young men all of the king's sons, for Amnon alone is dead. For by the command of Absalom, this has been determined from the day he violated his sister Tamar. Now therefore let not my lord and the king so take it to heart as to suppose that all of the king's sons are dead. Amnon alone is dead. And that's the truth.
Right.
But it bears the question, if Jonadab knew that, then why wasn't he being a good friend and protecting Amnon, or telling the king, hey, this is not good, you should go, this is what's going to happen.
Right.
Either Amnon is playing both sides.
Jonadab.
Either Jonadab is playing both sides and being a friend to Amnon, and also being a friend to Absalom, thinking that he's going to be the next king. Or he is, doesn't care. Either way, it's not a good friend. And so you see that. And so what happens is that David tears his clothes and mourns Amnon, and Absalom flees. Right. And we see that he flees to the king of Geshur, and David mourned for his son day after day. Now, Geshur is his grandfather, because he had married the king's daughter of Geshur. So Absalom runs to his mom's parents, and he's going to stay there. And the king, we leave David in this lesson mourning two sons. Right. He's mourning the fact that Amnon is dead, but he's also mourning the fact that Absalom has left. And the last verse of this says, so Absalom fled and went to Geshur and was there 3 years. And the spirit of the king longed to go to Absalom, because he was comforted about Amnon since he was dead. So David mourns Amnon, but he gets over that. Right. And now he misses Absalom too. So I don't know. I don't know what this makes you think.
Yeah.
But we see the consequences of David's sin with Bathsheba playing out in his own family. And we see that he doesn't have a connection with his children. And to the fact that they are raping each other and murdering each other. Mm-hmm. All of these are his children.
Right.
So I don't know. As a mother, the worst pain you can have is your children's pain, I think, in a lot of ways. So the lessons from here, I think about, we want to nip it in the bud, as Barney Fife would say, when we feel those inclinations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, not let it give birth.
Right. And be careful who we're listening to. Mm-hmm. Are we surrounding ourselves with people that say what we want to hear? Or do we have true friends that are willing to
love us enough to tell us what's true?
Yeah. So anyway, next week we want to look and see what happens, because right now we have an estranged son and father. But the story's not over.
Right. Thanks for listening and journeying with us on this side of the ceiling. See you next time.